Moving on, the United Nations says at least 47 people have been killed and 181 others wounded in recent days as Eastern forces seek to take Libya's capital from the internationally recognized government. The World Health Organization also warns that the renewed conflict risks expending medical supplies. The death toll, higher than that given by either side yet, appears to be mainly fighters, although it also includes some civilians, including 2 doctors.
The health facilities have reported in the last 3 days 47 dead and 181 wounded. Among the dead, there are also civilians, 181 wounded and 47 dead. Among the dead, there are also civilians, including 2 doctors who had been providing critically needed services to civilians in Tripoli, and we have sent you the statement on that yesterday. 1 doctor was reportedly killed while working as part of a field ambulance service. WHO has documented more than 46 attacks that impacted health workers and facilities throughout 2018-2019 across Libya. These attacks killed 8 health workers and patients and injured 24. We reiterate that targeting healthcare workers and health facilities is against the international humanitarian law. WHO is obviously concerned about the possibility of prolonged conflict in the heavily populated Tripoli. The prolonged conflict would drain the limited available medical supplies. Current health sector appeal of $43.5 million is only 6% funded. WHO is appealing to donors for emergency funds to cope with the current crisis. We are also concerned about migrants in detention centers in conflict-affected areas. Some of these people are on tuberculosis treatment, which can be then interrupted and expose them to unnecessary risk.
Meanwhile, the spokesperson for the UN Secretary General, Stefan Dujarric, says that the escalation of violence in and around Tripoli has caused the displacement of some 3,400 people. This is due to the number of people fleeing from fighting, which has blocked emergency services from reaching casualties and civilians.
Our humanitarian colleagues on the ground report that the escalation of violence in and around Tripoli has caused the displacement of some 3,400 people fleeing from fighting and has blocked emergency services from reaching casualties and civilians. Fighting has also damaged electricity lines. Clashes with heavy weapons are affecting residential areas, and an unknown number of civilians are unable to flee these locations. We're calling for a temporary humanitarian truce to allow for the provision of emergency services and the voluntary passage of civilians, including those wounded from the areas of conflict. Our humanitarian partners have stocked in place in multiple locations throughout Tripoli. These include food stocks for an additional 80,000 people for a period of 2 weeks and emergency medical supplies to treat up to 210,000 individuals over the next 3 months. This is in addition to recent distributions of emergency medical supplies that can treat up to 1 million individuals and shelter and non-food assistance for 15,000 families across Libya. The humanitarian coordinator for Libya, Mario Ribeiro, reminds all parties of their legal obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law to ensure the safety of all civilians and civilian infrastructure.
Joining us now is a security expert, Temitope Oludo, to discuss more on the fighting in Libya. Thank you for joining us on Network Africa. So Libya is back in the news as the crisis continues. Why is there resurgence in fighting? Are we back to square one?
Fortunately, Libya has not been really out for the past 8 years after the fall of Gaddafi. Fortunately, we have 2 active groups, one in the east and one in the west, are all fighting for supremacy within Libya. That was the start story for Libya and Africa.
Well, what role do you think the African Union can play in ending the crisis?
I think there is a lot that African do because as though Egypt and other African countries actually have interest in what is happening in Libya. And I think Libya will be a major player within African region, continent and countries like Nigeria and other very big countries should actually get involved. Because these are Africans, and there must be an African solution to this African challenge.
Security expert Temitope Oludu, thank you for speaking to us on Network Africa. Now, Algeria's parliament has named Abdul Qadir Ben Salah the Speaker of the Upper House as the country's interim president. He will replace Abdelaziz Bouteflika, who resigned last week following widespread protest. Mr. Ben Salah will run the country until new elections are held in 90 days, according to the North African country's constitution. However, protesters who are demanding sweeping democratic reforms are opposed to figures like Ben Salah, a close ally of Bouteflika and his inner circle, who dominated Algeria for decades. Shortly after the announcement in Parliament, hundreds of mostly students protested in the capital, now demanding the interim president's resignation. Still to come on Network Africa. Ivanka Trump, the daughter of U.S. President Donald Trump, is set to travel to Ethiopia and Cote d'Ivoire. Details coming up after the break.